These are stories and articles that I wrote on medium.com. And we left off yesterday. I was reading in April's stories. And so the article that I wanted to start with today was named Roger is Always Hijacking Our Office Conversations. And I think I had originally titled this something different, something about a coworker. But if you've ever worked in an office, then you know that there's always at least one coworker who feels that it's necessary to take over the conversation and make it all about them. And so I just kind of wanted to write about that. So, and let me turn that volume down again. Okay. So the story goes like this. The article goes like this. Roger's in the break room again. Pass it on, I whispered, as I passed Julia's cubicle on my way back to my section. Julia rolled her eyes and sent out a group email, omitting Roger, of course. Passing another of my coworkers named Bob, I thought back a couple of days when he interrupted me in the conference room. At the time, I was making a really good point about the new dress code policy, and everyone was paying attention to it. Bob interrupted to ask a question, and before I knew it, everyone was off in another direction, and I was left seething just a little bit. I'll let Bob get his coffee in the break room. Marcia? Don, my supervisor, stood near my cubicle, and I sat down, trying to straighten my paperwork. My desk was always a mess while I was in the thick of the workday. I glanced up at him and smiled. Yes, Don? Marcia, there's a rumor the new guy Roger is, what's the most tactful way to say this? He looked around the office for possible eavesdroppers, then lowered his voice even more. Well, I've heard he's not too sociable. Shoot, I've heard he's just plain disagreeable. You have a pretty good instinct for people. What do you think? I pretended to give it some thought, picking out a staple with my fingernail and trying to smother a laugh. The thing is, Don, as long as he's meeting his work deadlines, it doesn't really matter if he's disagreeable, does it? This isn't a social club. If you're not happy with his work, you're the boss. Tell him. In spite of Don's ears turning pink, he handled this slight rebuke pretty well. But we've worked together for 14 years, so I know just how far he can be pushed, and we weren't even close. As I watched him walk back to his office, I thought about Roger's first week here at Strine and Simmons. We had assumed his habit of constantly talking about himself was just insecurity, and it would eventually wear off. We were wrong. He'd been here 6 months now, and he never missed an opportunity to turn the conversation back to himself. If Jack and Harold were talking about boats, Roger would walk up and look like he was really listening to the back and forth banter. As soon as the sentence ended, he'd start talking about what he'd done in his last job or where he'd gone the last weekend, and then he'd ramble on for as long as they'd let him. It happened every day, every break or lunch period. I tried asking him one time about his family. It was like talking to a brick wall, like he didn't even hear me. No pause, no hesitation. He continued on with his monologue about what a great job he had done on that last project in spite of a couple of problems. But he'd pulled it off, and it was just fantastic, and how everyone was so pleased with the results. On and on. I think if he ran out of material, he just found alternate ways of saying the same thing again, again, and again. Within 2 weeks of his starting work, People were actively avoiding being in the same room with him. It didn't matter. Roger had no problem with hijacking other people's conversations. That was the evening I had the idea. What if we just let him talk? What if we actively encouraged Roger to talk, but more importantly, what if we didn't let him stop? The next morning, I got to the office early, eager to lay out my strategy for Don. Actually, to Don, and see what he thought. Roger loves to talk. He's an expert, you might say. Why shouldn't we take advantage of his expertise? I was trying to convince my supervisor, who wasn't so sure about my brilliant idea. I think I was whittling down his objections, otherwise known as winning him over, because he was making little sounds of approval. They may have been chortles covered up by coughs, but a win is a win. That afternoon, we all got the email. Don had scheduled a session in the conference room for the following morning, gave a brief outline of the specific case, and called the staff in one by one in person to clue them in. At 9 a.m. the next morning, everyone was seated around the conference table with notebooks and steaming coffee. Don introduced the case we were working on and invited comments. As soon as Roger interrupted with, "Well, at my last job, I tried," we knew we had him hooked. Everyone had been instructed to stay silent when Roger was talking. If and when he stopped, we'd all been given a list of questions to ask him to get him going again. Lunch was ordered in, salads and sandwiches eaten at the conference table, with questions aimed at Roger, who appeared to be enjoying the event immensely. I have to hand it to him, that boy did love talking about himself. Around 4:30 that afternoon, Don concluded the session. I think we've got some good ideas thanks to Roger's considerable experience in these matters. Roger smiled smugly at no one in particular. However, I think we still have much to learn from him. I've still got questions. Anybody else still have questions? Lengthy pause as, dismayed, everyone immediately grasped where this was heading. Therefore, I sincerely believe it is in our best interest to meet again in the morning to get those questions answered. A new list of questions was circulated, and the next morning the grilling of the session began promptly at 9 o'clock. Julia and a couple of the other girls were beginning to show signs of boredom, but they bravely carried on. The guys had a bet going on as to the specific number of the word I that Roger would utter that day, so they were carefully taking notes. At one point, Mark did a fist pump, caught himself, and smoothed his hair back, glancing quickly around the table. Around 2 o'clock, Roger began picking up his water a little more frequently and clearing his throat. Did he notice that he'd answered the same question no less than 5 times? He also began taking longer pauses between sentences. Julia had almost forgotten her part and nearly dropped the ball a couple of times. If Roger stopped talking, she was supposed to say, "That was fascinating. Could you give a little more detail about that?" And then take copious notes as if hanging on every word. She was actually working on her grocery and to-do lists. Between the 8 of us in the room, we managed to keep Roger talking for 2 straight days. At the end of day 2, Roger's voice was audibly hoarse. But Don wasn't through picking the poor guy's brain and decided that what was needed was a recap on day 3, which was Thursday. Thursday morning, we sat uninterestedly at the conference room table, none of us looking forward to another long day listening to Roger. Come to think of it, Roger didn't look that happy himself. "We've heard some good ideas over the past 2 days, thanks to Roger," he paused and led the group in a round of applause. "However, I believe what we need at this point is for Roger to address the group without the use of questions and just sum up his thoughts. Roger, you have our attention. Don sat back down and the group looked expectantly at Roger. Roger cleared his throat and looked at his notes. He opened his mouth to speak and nothing came out. He cleared his throat and took a sip of water. Still, no sound came out when he opened his mouth. Don asked him if everything was okay, and Roger just shook his head. Roger, why don't you take the day and make an appointment to get checked out by a medical professional? Let's give this a day or so, and we may pick back up on Monday. Everyone filed out of the room. I stayed behind to close the door. So what do you think? I looked up at Don hopefully. I think we've just wasted most of the week on this harebrained idea, is what I think. He shook his head in disgust. Well, I don't. I think we made progress. I really do. Let's see what tomorrow is like, okay? Roger's mother called in the next morning to report that he wouldn't be coming in, as the doctor diagnosed laryngitis and recommended he not return to work until at least Monday. On Monday, however, Roger sat at his desk and mostly kept to himself. About a week later, he sent in his letter of resignation and assured everyone that although he would miss being in the office, he had decided to focus on writing his memoirs and would be taking a break from the corporate environment. And then I put a link in my article to another writer's article for giving me the story idea, because sometimes the best ideas that you have for writing any particular plot is ideas that you get from other people. And so that's one of the reasons why you should, if you are interested in writing, you should also read as much as possible and from a variety of sources, because you never know where your next idea is going to come from. Okay, so now let me go back to my next article that I wrote after that. And let me see. Let me leave a note. Okay, so let's go back to April and oh, there we go. Okay, let me see. Alrighty. Okay, and yesterday I mentioned that some of the articles, or a large portion of the articles that I wrote on Medium.com, are articles about the platform itself. And so that's what this next article was. Well, not necessarily about the Medium platform, but about writing in general. And the name of the article was, Who Else Has a Compulsion to Write? Writers often feel like that there are stories that they need to write. Maybe it's a plot or a character that's been inside their head, some story idea that they've had for a long time, and they feel that urge, that need to put it down on paper. But this could happen with people who keep a journal or a diary as well. They may just feel that need to write in their diary or their journal every day. Okay, why? Why do you write? What motivates you to get up each day and find something to write about? Is it for the sheer act of creating? Do you have information or knowledge you feel the need to impart? Do you write for pure enjoyment? Do you have the desire for writing to be your primary source of income? Maybe it's a combination of several reasons. For me, I love words and finding ways to say something in the most perfect way possible. If I can earn a little money doing that, wonderful. Everyone has their motivation for writing. Even though he admits only a couple of articles out of his 300 written have earned him any real money, Tom C. says, I have made a deal with myself that I will write and publish every day until I am earning 5 figures a month from content creation. Maybe in a year, maybe in 5 years. I am patient. I can wait. And I might take just a second to point out that Medium.com is a platform in which anyone can earn money by writing short stories, and Medium does not limit you on your content. You can write poetry or fiction, stories about your life, or any other topic that you can think of. It's all being written about. There are hundreds of thousands of writers on Medium, and not all of them make a living wage, I should say, from writing on Medium, but most of them do earn some money. Armagon Tanvir, which tells you that writers are accepted from many different countries, tells us why he is challenging himself to write and publish every day for 30 days. For starters, it will help me in becoming consistent. Consistency is one thing, but I genuinely am interested in becoming a better writer. By writing an article daily, even on weekends, I am looking to change my mindset from focusing on the input to focusing on the output. Instead of worrying about finding a perfect topic to write on, I will actually be spending my energy on writing the content. Joe May Spellhoff shares, so I write and read and think and write some more. It has become my life. It has become my joy, my work, my purpose. Some of us have doubts about our writing, but we keep going. Walter Reed says it's a compulsion, even if most of it ends up staying in your drafts folder way too long. I spend most of my mornings writing fragments of sentences, weird ideas, or even just titles of stories that I feel compelled to write down. When a story isn't ready, I don't feel the need to justify its existence. The Mohith Impact admits he is ambitious. He says, here lies the question, what makes writing difficult for me right now? There is an underlying intention behind it, and it comes from a sense of ambition, that my essays are going to help people to see the world in a new light. Or it's the beginning of a certain kind of self-help book. And also I should point out that a lot of people who write on Medium.com have actually used their articles to build up chapters for books that they've published later on. So that's one of the reasons why a lot of people write on there as well, is to build up enough material, enough content, so that they can publish books on Amazon or through outside publishers. It's a perfect way to start a book of any sort. Every book starts with a chapter, a paragraph, a word, Matt Hampton tells us what to do if we doubt ourselves as a writer. He says, just tell me a story. Only you can tell me the story in your mind right now. If you remain silent, if your pen remains still, it is lost forever. Those stories, whatever amount of them you have, are your gifts to the world, but you must tell them for us to receive them. And you can, storyteller. When in doubt, tell me a story. No matter what your motivation or style of writing or genre, you are a writer. You can wow people with your words. You can make them laugh or cry or get angry or move them to heroic deeds. That, my friend, is real power. And that story was written, that article was written on April the 13th. Okay, and now let's see what the next story was. Okay. April, let me see if it'll let me get back to him again. There we go. Okay. Now, some of these, maybe not the articles so much, some of these upcoming stories you will also find as standalone stories in my list of videos, so you can look for them. I don't know that I'm up to the point of publishing stories from April 2022, but all of these, especially the fiction ones, will become standalone stories in my list of videos. The next article that I wrote was How to Build a Human Being. And it was actually an article written on the Human Genome Project, which just goes to tell you that you can write on any topic you want to on Medium. Anything that you find interesting, you can turn into an interesting article or story for someone else. The Human Genome Project. On April 14, 2003, researchers announced the end of the Human Genome Project. Within 13 years, they had successfully determined, stored, and made available to the public the sequences of almost all the genetic content of the human genome. More than 2,800 researchers from France, Germany, Japan, China, the UK, and the USA worked on the project, which was completed 2 years ahead of schedule and under budget. Do we know whose blood was sequenced? No. Scientists asked for volunteers to donate blood samples for the study, and they obtained 5 to 10 times as many samples as they actually needed. Before the test, they removed the labels from the samples so that the study would be completely anonymous. Who can see the results of genome sequencing? Every part of the sequencing was made public as soon as it was completed. The information was posted by the scientists almost every day in freely accessible databases. Your genome can be sequenced now in about 1 day, although analyzing it will take much longer. A doctor is able to see if you are developing specific diseases or have a predisposition for one, and they can come up with treatments unique for your body. The scientific magic of sequencing. Humans have between 50 and 300 million base pairs of chromosomes. Scientists working on the sequencing project cut these base pairs into fragments, 150 to 200,000 base pairs, and cloned them in bacteria so that they could be prepared in large quantities for study. These are further fragmented into subclones and loaded into the sequencer, the sequencing machine, and then assembled by the computer into a representation of the DNA. Interesting facts about the Human Genome Project. The entire human genome takes 3 gigabytes of computer storage. About 97% of DNA consists of sequences that have no known function and are referred to as junk DNA. If you and I started reciting our individual genetic code at a rate of 1 letter per second, it would take almost 8.5 minutes before we reached a difference. If all the DNA in your body was put end to end, it would reach to the sun and back some 600 times. 100 trillion times 6 feet divided by 92 million miles. If you typed 60 words per minute for 8 hours each day, it would take you over 50 years to type the human genome. Genome sequencing and COVID-19. In contrast to the 3 billion letters that make up a person's genetic blueprint, COVID-19's genome only contains 30,000. Eric Green, director of the National Human Genome Research Institute, says thanks to technology that made the Human Genome Project possible, it's actually quite trivial to sequence a given virus, and that's why it got done so quickly. The global population didn't just benefit from COVID-19 sequencing only. The research is being applied to many other human ailments. The information collected on sequencing has allowed research to be done more quickly on other diseases such as macular degeneration, Alzheimer's, and multiple sclerosis. I thought all of that was really interesting, but I'm not surprised that it only got 3 comments. Although those are interesting too. One reader said, "Now if we could only sequence thoughts too and understand everyone." And that's a pretty interesting idea, actually. I could see a couple of good stories coming out of that. Okay, alrighty, so let me, whoops. Okay, and after that is, another article. On something boring. Okay, so on April 16th, I wrote a story, an article called "This Binge Reader Wants to Read Your Desert Stories." And I call myself a binge reader on Medium because if I find a writer that I enjoy, I will often read several of their stories in a row. There was one time that I actually read 20 articles and stories by the same author in a row. And I just think it's interesting because you're not going to enjoy every article that you read. So when you come across somebody who writes in a style that you like, it's very easy to go on to another one that they've written. Even if it's fiction, even if it's an article about something in the news. All right, so this one is about sand. Okay, many of you have written about the desert, from travel stories to poems. I've enjoyed reading dozens of your desert writings this week. I want to read more. Not all deserts are hot. I always assumed that every desert um, ecosystem was just hot, or hot and humid, or hot and dry. And not all deserts are made of sand only, which were both interesting facts for me to learn. But most deserts have breathtaking vistas and vast expanses that allow us to feel our lack of size in all of that openness. Tell me about the deserts you've seen or how the desert affects you. Photographers enjoy working in the desert, and the colors, the light, the flora and fauna that are unique to the area provide a rich bounty of opportunities for travel bloggers as well. I want to see your photos. People visit the desert to hike the dunes, to stargaze, and to wait for the sunset and sunrise. So let me binge your desert writings. Camille Cusimano, in search of material for a travel article, wrote about her view of the deserts. I guess a specific desert. Oh, the Anza Borrego Desert. She said colors shifted out of the baked mud pie. Dazzling ripples in muted gray, smoke, mold green, brown, russet. What struck me about the spectacle was that it could be any decade or century. Nothing marked time. This is an amazing article if you've ever wanted to explore the desert. And then, of course, I left a link to her article. Rose Milana waxes poetic about the desert in her story, Natural Thought Prompt number 3, Colors in a Tundra. She says, everyone thinks of the desert as endless sand and the frozen tundra as endless ice. There's no variation, no life, no color. Well, that's not true. Kind of. Even in these places, life and color still exist. You just have to go looking for them. Open your eyes and search. Andre Tapalaga introduces us to Jadav Molai Payeng, who spent 40 years of his life turning a small desert into a forest by planting over 1 million trees. I loved that story about this man who, I'm not sure, I can't remember what country he was from, but for 40 years he planted trees and actually reclaimed a section of desert back for his country. I just thought that that was amazing. Joseph Nightingale reminds us that the Sahara Desert once teemed with life, and there are some people who are working hard to reverse the dry, barren conditions. Currently, over 500 million people are living on land undergoing desertification. And so much of this I didn't even know until I read these articles. The desert is a wonderful or dangerous place depending on your point of view. Umair Haque says the desert is like a life lived poorly. Stephen M. Tomick talks about the dangers of being in the desert in his brief story. Tom Stevenson tells us the 5 books he'd want with him if he was stuck on a desert island, while Matt Lillywhite gives us his book recommendations. Hint, think survival books. Yes, there really are some desert islands on this planet. Others love the desert so much they decide to make their home there. Amit Gupta talks about loving their hot, sunny, dry desert home. Not everyone does well living in the desert, but many swear by its health benefits. And then I left a link at the end of that story to several pieces of poetry that were written by writers here on Medium. And so there were probably 6 poems that I linked to that had to do with the theme of the desert. My next article was written on April 17th. It was called, Why Don't Wars Have Cool Names Anymore? And this article was written after I came across, I think, an article maybe in Wikipedia called, and it was on the topic of the Pastry War of 1838, which I'd never heard about. And I thought, that's kind of a cool name for a war or a conflict. Calling it a pastry war, it doesn't sound like something that you'd really be too frightened of. And it was yesterday in history, 1838. In April of 1838, Monsieur Remontel, a French pastry chef, claimed that in 1832, Mexican officers looted his shop in Tacubaya, near Mexico City. He demanded 60,000 pesos as compensation, although his shop was valued at 1,000 pesos. At the time, a typical day's wage was 1 peso. Remontel wasn't the only French national who was complaining about their treatment in Mexico, however, and in 1838, Prime Minister Louis Mathieu Mollet demanded that Mexico pay 600,000 pesos in reparation. When Mexico ignored this demand, the King of France ordered a fleet of his ships to blockade all Mexican ports from Yucatan to the Rio Grande, and eventually to seize the city of Veracruz, the most important port on the Gulf Coast. When the French military captured Veracruz by December 1838, Mexico declared war on France. This led to Santa Anna coming out of retirement. Remember, he had fought at the Alamo in 1836, and leading the Mexican forces at the Battle of Veracruz. Santa Anna was severely wounded in his leg, which had to be amputated. The leg was buried with full military honors. This brief war could have been named many things: the war over Tacubaya, Remontel's rebellion, the Mollet massacre, the French farce, the Veracruz conflict, but someone chose the Pastry War. The Pastry War was not the only war in history with an unusual name. The War of Jenkins' Ear, fought between Britain and Spain, 1739 to 1748. The War of the Oaken Bucket, Bologna and Modena, 1325. The War of the Golden Stool, Ashanti Ghana and Britain, 1900. The War of the Three Sanchos, Castilian Civil Wars, 1065 to 1071. Aztec Flower Wars, Aztec and Tlaxcala, 1450 to 1454. The Fantastic War, Spain and Portugal, 1762 to 1763. Men have fought over some pretty strange things in their history. Jenkins' Ear was a severed ear that had been pickled for a keepsake. The Oaken Bucket was a bucket stuffed with Modenese treasures. The Golden Stool was a symbol of tribal leadership and a matter of pride. The War of the Three Sanchos was a war between three fighting cousins. The Flower Wars was actually an agreement for volunteer sacrifices on both sides. The Fantastic War was so named because the Portuguese thought it was amazing that so few soldiers' lives were lost. War is an ugly thing. Most wars have been fought simply because no one could come to an acceptable compromise for the benefit of both sides. People accept a leader who appears to have their best interest at heart, but few leaders can be completely altruistic and rule selflessly. History has proven that a little power can ruin even the best of intentions. Interesting name or not, a war is just an excuse to fight rather than apologize. Because if I walk into a French pastry shop and hurt some donuts, I'm certainly going to say I'm sorry while I pay whatever they cost. Okay. All right. Now, the next piece that I wrote on April the 18th is a fictionalized historical account. This did not really happen. Parts of it are in history, but this is a piece of fiction using some of the truth, or should I say bending the truth? Okay, this is called The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. Let me tell you about my dad, Paul. Let me introduce myself. My name is Paul Revere Jr. No, I'm not the Paul Revere that rode to Lexington on April 18 last year. That was my father. Actually, my grandfather's name was Paul Revere also, but he was born Apollos Rivoire, so I guess that's why I'm a junior and not Paul III. I don't mind talking about my dad, though. I admire him for his bravery and convictions, even though he's made plenty of mistakes. I get asked about the night he and Will Dawes rode to warn everyone about the British invasion. I've heard some people think he said, "The British are coming." He didn't really say that because that would have been tipping off those who were still loyal to Britain. The actual message was, "The regulars are about." That night, he also arranged to have the signal lit in the Old North Church to indicate if the British could be expected by land or sea. My dad didn't ride by himself that night either. He had lots of friends who helped spread the word about independence from the British. Here are some other things you might not remember about my dad. His parents, my grandfather Apollos and my grandmother Deborah, met in Boston. Apollos was a French Huguenot who came to America as a teenager and was a silversmith apprentice. Grandfather's last name was Rivoire, and he changed that name too to Revere. Then he named Dad after him. My dad, as the oldest living son, became a silversmith apprentice like his father, which gave him a lot of social opportunities in the community. My dad has always felt strongly about religion and politics. I think he got that from my grandpa, and disagreed with grandfather on more than one occasion. They even got so mad they had a fist fight one time. My dad had 11 brothers and sisters, but he was only 20 when Grandpa Paul died, and he couldn't legally take over the silver shop, so he enlisted in the army during the French and Indian War to have regular income. As soon as he turned 21, though, he returned to Boston and took over the family business. 2 years later, he married my mother, Sarah, and my oldest sister, Deborah, was born 8 months later. My dad was very smart, so when the economy was in a recession, he learned dentistry to help pay the bills. This skill came in handy later when one of his former patients, who was a soldier, Dr. Joseph Warren, was in the Battle of Bunker Hill and buried in a mass grave. My dad's friends found the mass grave, and it was only by previous dental work that Dad was able to identify Dr. Warren's body so they could give him a proper burial. In his 50s, my dad really got into his artisan work. He began engraving in silver and gold and did work in bell casting manufacturing with me and my older brother, Joseph Warren Revere, who took over the business when our father passed away at 83 years of age in 1818. Like any son, I'm proud of my father. He had strong convictions and opinions and was not afraid to stand up for what he believed. I learned a lot from his example, and I like to think that I have made him proud by the way I have lived my life. Signed, Paul Revere Jr. So I'm hoping that you could tell most of those were actual facts about Paul Revere. And some of the stuff, I studied that in American history, and I still thought that he said the British are coming, but apparently that was not his message. Okay. My next article was, about fur babies. I didn't realize that pets were called fur babies until I visited my cousin in Florida, and she referred to her little lap dog. I'm not even sure the breed, but she referred to him as her fur baby. Dogs are called man's best friend, furry friends, fur babies, and just pets. They love unconditionally, make us laugh, keep us company, and sometimes do things we don't understand. Whether they are puppies we watched being born or adopted, they give and inspire devotion, as shown by the many stories from dog lovers here on Medium.com. What do you do when your 200-pound Dane hits his dream cycle in the early morning hours and he's sleeping in the same bed with you? Roz Potenza gives a hilarious account in her story, The Paws of Giants. And of course, I left the link to her article in there as well, in case you want to go on Medium.com and find her story. The Paws of Giants by Roz Potenska. Insider published this remarkable video story about dog owners who resemble their pets. Or is it the other way around? Did you know dogs can fly? Jack Shepard shares one photographer's fabulous, fearsome frisbee dogs in his article, 19 Photos of Dogs Majestically Catching Frisbees. They are pretty cool, but you don't have wings, pretty sure you still can't fly. I belly laughed at Sean Kernan's article, If Dogs Wrote Self-Improvement Articles. I dare you not to crack a smile. Bev Potter reads her dog's letter from doggy jail. Poor puppy has no clue what he did to deserve prison. And the very first line, it says, Dearest mother, I write to you from the depths of this hellish place from which all hope has fled. Poor puppy. David Milgram tugged at my heartstrings when he wrote about losing a dog he wasn't even aware that he was attached to. Oh my goodness. Marla Rose tells us how her furry companion kept her going when times got really rough. She says, at the end of the day, after helping John up the stairs and into bed, Romeo would settle behind my knees and sigh as I slept on my side, spooning me, a soft, warm, embodied reminder of my life before this time, and a gentle encouragement to keep going. Warren Brand says humanity can learn a great deal of how to behave towards one another from our dogs. The name of his article was Dogs as Mentors, 3 Reasons to Love Your Dog Even More Than You Do, and One Dark Truth. Usually, stories about your pets get a lot of response on Medium because everyone has had an animal that they were attached to at some point. The next article I wrote was Family, your link to your past and bridge to your future. Families are people who choose to be together in a relationship. As little as two people can make up a family, but there's no limit to how large your family can be. Does your family live in the same house or is it spread across the globe? Do you have friends who are closer than some family members? That happens. Maybe you have family members that you haven't spoken with for years. That happens too. When I was a teenager, my best friend was Nona. She got married at 17 and moved away, but when we talked on the phone, it would feel as if no time at all had passed. The conversation would just pick up where it left off. Years later, my mother received a copy of a genealogy book that a relative put together, and the family tree showed that Nona and I had a common ancestor. So not only were we best friends, but we'd actually been cousins. Third cousins once removed, all along. What is your definition of a family? I read a lot of stories about family, and here are a few that I especially enjoyed. M. Lindblom is apprehensive about raising a family in a world we live in today with all of its problems. After years of being convinced she didn't want children, she and her husband had a daughter, and she says she has no regrets. Her definition of family? Family can and should be anyone that we love and with whom we want to share parts of our lives. Individuals can and should be able to define family based upon their own unique situation. She also talks about how her thinking affects her artwork, and she included one of her paintings in her story. Parents and children tend to grow apart as children get older. One grown son talks about showing his father how to send gifts and how this has led to increased communication and some funny moments. Topher Freeman reports, okay, maybe not 10 gifts in a row, but I generally like to get messages from my dad. I'm glad that my dad finally got a smartphone, and I'll take all the gift messages with pleasure. Treasure the time you have with your parents, and treasure the silly communications when you cannot be together in person. Adrienne Beaumont is one of those parents who encourages their children to get involved with extracurricular activities. Among these are swimming, piano, rugby, trombone, soccer, trumpet, jazz, ballet, tap dancing, acrobatics, netball, choir, theater, violin, drums, basketball, flute, and cross-country running. Sounds like a recipe for an exhausted but proud parent. She leaves it to the reader to decide if she was being a pushy parent. Deanna Ritola lists several simple daily rituals for families with small children to help them appreciate their place in the family and to build trust. These rituals can also help us because we have helped to cultivate a safe and trusting relationship with our kiddos. At the heart of relationship is trust. The small things we do every day to honor ourselves, our children, and our place in the wider scheme of things teach our children that they can trust us and they can trust themselves too. Pomeroy says, that's actually their pen name, tells us about an issue with homelessness in his family when he was young and how it continues to affect his life. Today he makes a point of helping others with a blessing box in his neighborhood, and he provides links for those who need help paying their rent. Needless to say, because of that time in his life and many other experiences, I have depression and anxiety. Homelessness and family problems wreak havoc on kids in ways people can't imagine. And the name of his article was Homeless and Helpless, My Childhood Story. You can actually search that on medium.com if you want to read that story by Pomeroy Says. My father passed away in his early 50s. That was almost 40 years ago. But I still remember the unexpected news and the pain of knowing he was gone and wouldn't get to see his grandson grow up. It hurts to lose family members. Heather Hartberger talks about losing her grandmother and shares a journal entry she wrote not long after her grandmother's passing. She reminds us, never forget the people most precious and close to your heart. They can be gone before you know it and never ever replaced. Stephanie Trumbull describes the loss of her father in her article, My Beloved Pop, and how she is comforted knowing that his last days were well spent. She says, he and my mom traveled and lived life on their own terms until my dad got sick. They made the most of the time they had together, and I know if anyone had asked, he would have said he had a good life, a really good life, but they just ran out of time. Families don't always get along. Even when you're connected by genes, there will be disagreements, differing opinions, and days when you are not at your best. Sometimes there are ways to work through problems, such as Clara Jane Holloway's experience, and I just left the link of her article. And Ruby Lee has a house full of adult children that just might be driving her crazy. Other families are just plain dysfunctional, as Amy C. commiserates with us in her article. She says, I know what you're thinking. What happens if you are the crazy one? You are. I mean, you're here, aren't you? Trying to convince other people they're nuts to prove you're not nuts? Carolyn Bond gives some advice on how to be a loving but firm boss in your family. She says, once I learned how to use this approach, fighting among the kids stopped and misbehavior was drastically reduced. I'm not saying that we had a perfect family, but I didn't have to give commands and nag to get the kids' attention. And once you've grown up, don't forget to send a love letter to your parents to let them know you appreciated everything they did for you. Even if they were imperfect, they gave you life. A life in which you can be anything or do anything you want. It's a bargain indeed. The world needs more family. Be kind to the ones you spend your days with. Okay, let me read the rest of the paragraph. The world needs more family. Be kind to the ones you spend your days with. They'll be gone one day, and good memories can enrich your life. Okay, I know it's really close to the hour mark of me doing this live stream, but I'm going to do one more. And this is a fiction piece that I wrote called Bad Seed Baby. And this is one that I will be putting as a standalone story in my video section. So hopefully within the next 2 to 3 weeks, you'll find this story as well. It won't be in my own voice. I'll use a different audio service to read the story. They watch me from the other side of the padded door. I can feel them staring, but they can't take away what really matters. There, my poor baby, come to Mama. I cuddled my baby close to my heart, rocking her back and forth in comfort. How I longed for her sweet little voice to call me Mama once more. She felt so still, so light. My sweet baby Valentina. Her soft blonde curls framed her face, but her blue eyes remained closed. As long as I could hold her, caress her tiny face, and sing her a lullaby, both of us could keep the pain at bay. Her pain so long ago from scarlet fever, and my pain at watching the light go out of her eyes. My sweet baby Valentina, born on Valentine's Day 30 years ago, and always with me now. You know, at the time that I wrote that story, it was meant to be creepy. I'm hoping it still comes across as a little creepy. All right, well, that's it for today. And I was sick last week with a cold, and so my throat is still kind of a little raw. Otherwise, I would probably try to keep reading so that I can uh, continue this project of transferring all of my writings over from medium.com to my YouTube channel. But I will be back again, and I will start there with every dawn is a chance to start over. And there will be some more, let me see. Right after that is another fictionalized history piece. And then there's another article coming up about me and my sister, a day that we spent at the river, on the Kaimishi River. And so thank you for joining me today, and hopefully I'll see you back again. Bye.